Okay, well, I guess on that note, I'll get started. I'd like to begin by thanking EXALT for hosting this conversation and offering me the opportunity to share my work. My name is Shayan Shokrgozar. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation at the University of Bergen. And my work is largely situated in political ecology, agrarian studies, and energy geographies. Now, for the past 2.5 years, I've been researching the solar photovoltaic sector in India at various scales, right, from rural household electrification done by NGOs to some of the world's largest industrial scale solar parks, like the Budla Solar Park in Rajasthan. And, there is no shortage of issues to study when considering solar PV rollout, governance, its finance, its geopolitics, scale, imaginaries, and the list goes on. To a large extent, I've had the freedom to be guided by my own interests and intuitions. And what has increasingly come to capture my interest has been the implications of solar PV rollout for agrarian people. And especially in Western Rajasthan and in the Jaisalmer district, just to give you context, Rajasthan is about the same size as Finland, slightly larger. And Jaisalmer district alone is the size of Switzerland or the Netherlands. So we're talking about incredibly large areas with not that many social science, energy, social science really taking place. But what has really drawn my attention to the struggles of agropastoral and indigenous peoples, more broadly in my work, but in this context, agropastoral peoples, has been how resource-dependent people are losing their ability for the continuation of their livelihoods in the face of military, industrial, and other developmental and extractive projects. To give you some examples, the western frontiers of Rajasthan are also the borderlands of Pakistan. Nation with which India has had hostile relations. So there's large military presence in the area, which has also brought a lot of infrastructure as a result of it. But then there's also large mines, primarily for gemstone. Those are growing, which affect the local waterways, roads, power lines, urban development, water canals like the Indira Gandhi Canal. All of which have posed their own unique challenges to this delicate desert ecosystem. I won't go over this, but I guess we've prefaced that it's my first time sharing this paper and trying to articulate my thoughts around it. I'm doing a follow-up fieldwork in a couple of months to fill in some of the kind of data gaps that I have. But yeah, any thoughts, resources, reflections can be helpful in my efforts to write this out. Okay, thanks on that note. Quote, throughout human history, ideas of civilization, empire, sovereignty, accumulation, Ternelius, capital, and modernity have become layered and intertwined to form a relational for intensification of both social and planetary exploitation. Those are not my words. They're by Judith Shapiro and John Andrew McNeish in their work, the book Our Extractive Age. But the mobilization of energy as fuel has been a significant part of bringing about this social and planetary exploitation and the rapidly changing climate as a result, right? Social cohesion and ecological degradation. That much of this mobilization has been done not to enable decent living conditions, that is, conditions that allow for thermal comfort and food and clothing and shelter and other material and spiritual needs for the fulfillment of well-being, but instead to essentially mobilize energy to fuel the growing demand for material and energy throughput. Right. So, and also industrialization and developmental projects. And this has been done on the back of peoples that Fanon often refers to as the wretched of the earth. Right, they live there, matters little where or how they die there, matters little where nor how. Famous book by Fanon in the book. But the mobilization of fossil fuels as energy to do work was itself a form of energy transition primarily from human labor, done mostly in the form of slavery, into coal and oil and then later gas. And I don't think many of us see the fossil fuel world as being necessarily a liberatory world, right? So energy transitions alone do not bring emancipatory, liberatory, just transitions. It's important to think about the kind of politics, the political ontology of what's taking place around it. And I would say that in addition to being a material manifestation of incumbent institutions and social relations, current energy practices are also the product of incumbent ideas about decision-making, centralized as opposed to decentralized and community-based. The good life, well, what it consists of, is it modernity or is it engaging with place-based and rich tapestry of lifeways? And the nature of energy itself, whether it's a commodity or a common, and what actually energy itself consists of. I'll circle back to this in a bit. So I think with some of this, I will try to bring this kind of to energy imaginaries in India as a result. So Nehru was India's first prime minister after independence. And here's a quote from him, which he argues that electricity is perhaps the most necessary and the most revolutionary thing which you can take into the rural areas. The moment you take electricity, all kinds of things begin to move. Petty industries grow up, agriculture is affected. Everything, in fact, is affected. The whole life of people is changed. Sunila Kali, in her great work on the history of electricity in India, argues that Nehru's belief in the power of electricity post-independence era was a vision of its unification through modernization. And these imaginaries, you see them being carried out and lived through, very much in contemporary society. A few colleagues and I are working on a paper trying to, articulate what imaginaries of solar India consists of. And broadly speaking, we argue that there are twofold. One is seeing it as a national mission, a mission in which India brands itself as a leader in environmental protection and alleviating energy security concerns, in kind of like bringing about universal electricity access. And also depicting solar energy as a modern source, as opposed to, kind of like, fire and so forth, burning fuel in that way. But secondly, as a win-win discourse, right, as an eco-friendly economic opportunity that will generate employment, that will enhance expertise, that will expand business horizons, and so forth. But there is a backdrop to solar India that I will spend much of the remaining minutes kind of talking about. And because the thing is that together, these material and spiritual orientations about what energy is and how it should be produced has resulted in a specific configuration when it comes to control over land and access to resources. Rebanding community lands to commodity frontiers, what is referred to as wastelands, and then resource frontiers, right? Extractive projects, and in this case, industrial scale. So my good friend David Singh, who presented an earlier EXALT seminar, for example, has explored how the wind energy projects in Gujarat, which is south of Rajasthan, are a process of frontier making and control of space. In this case, the control of Muslim minority and lower caste areas by the Hindu right. Also, my friend and colleague Ryan Stock has written several rich accounts of the implications of solar park on dispossession and creation of highly racialized and also gendered surplus population of landless pleasance. For those of you familiar with the work of Vandana Shiva, solar parks demonstrate the same type of development strategies that she warns against, driven by industrialization and globalization that lead to environmental degradation and social inequalities. To give you a bit of a background on the area that my fieldwork was in, the place-based lifeways of agropastoral Rajasthanis is practiced around herding goats, cows, sheep, camels, etc. And also growing subsisting crops, such as millets for subsistence primarily. And there are some ancient agricultural practices, I'll circle back to that in a second, but the public lands have several categories. They're lands that belong to governments. Some are referred to as wastelands, other as water body catchment areas, others pasture land and sacred forests, or what locals refer to as orons. And in addition, now some people have private lands in these areas, which they use for seasonal farming and as pasture. Some even have tube wells, which allows them to farm longer in the year. And people's connection to the land is intimate. It is often described to me as being a part of their family. And the orons, these are sacred groves, sacred forests, because they're dedicated to gods or legends or warriors or deities. And there are strict customs dictating how and when the lands can be used and by whom. This is where you also find the Kejri tree, the sacred tree that cannot be cut in accordance to local values. The Bishna tribe with whom I lived for part of my field work sacrificed about 350 people in 1730 in order to protect a single Kejri tree from being felled, which the Maharaja of Jodhpur at the time wanted to use, I believe, for his palace. It's referred to as the Fijayarli massacre. So when speaking to people, there is a lot of frustration about the felling of Kejri trees for the development of solar parks. And the idea here is that developers want large tracts of undisturbed lands. So which is why a lot of the trees are felled. Now, one of the problems that exists in this area is that some of the orons enjoy legal protection. You can't just appropriate them for something else. But because a lot of it is based in oral culture, they're not necessarily appropriately classified as such. And sometimes they're misclassified as wastelands. And its encroachment, including by solar development, doesn't just lead to loss of pasture. People have been using these areas for hundreds of years, but it's also an insult in a way to local value systems. An interlocutor I spoke with told me, they came from Delhi and categorized our lands in the 50s as wasteland. And now these wastelands are being given to energy people. Now, I'm happy to talk about this more if there are questions about the orons, and I say a bit more about it. But what is more is that the public lands often contain private lands, sometimes within them, sometimes around them. And because developers want large tracts of undisturbed lands for laying down the solar PVs in long rows, these private lands have been appropriated to a mixture of legal and sometimes extra-legal methods. These include corruption or ongoing harassment, sometimes threats of violence. So kind of thinking about this context as speaking with a researcher in Jodhpur who works on protecting heritage sites. And that's where the title of this actually talk and likely paper comes from. The biggest problem we have now is that our feelings have ended. And he went on to say, it's loss of attachment. If your heart is not connected anymore, why will you protect it? That meaning heritage. So this kind of goes, to show the kind of social and ecological connection to land. So overall, there's a recognition that agripastoral peoples in Jaisalmer are faced with less arable land available to farm and herd, but also bleak non-farming and herding futures. They're alienated from the means of production and yet not really absorbed into a new economy. Speaking with a local activist in Jaisalmer, saying that a lot of these jobs that are created by solar parks are temporary, and it's primarily for men who get the construction and security and so forth and so on jobs, whereas farming and pastoral work is permanent and it involves all the members of the family. So the other thing I'd say is that these struggles extend beyond the realm of human into the non-human or other than human. What we see here is a statue of a great Indian bustard. These are the largest flying birds in India. And there are only about 100 to 150 individuals left. And they primarily live in the Jaisalmer district. Now, because the power from these solar parks is being evacuated to the national grid and larger areas, because obviously there isn't that much demand for the electricity in the local areas, and in fact, local villagers often have 6 to 8 hours of electricity a day, despite the fact that, as far as I can see, is wind turbines and solar panels. There are huge infrastructures for evacuating power, and the Indian bustards have several cases of them colliding and being electrocuted by the grid. And this was made by some local activists in remembering the loss of the GIB in this Oran, which is close nearby here. And what I would say is that the GIB is a prominent case, the Great Indian Bustard, but there are many other less prominent ones that doesn't garner as much attention. For example, you have the desert cats that, speaking to local wildlife activists, were telling me that they used to be quite prominent, but are now rare to find, amongst others. So I brought this up to a retired energy policymaker when I was interviewing him. And I said, how do you feel about this? And he said, only 20 bustards leading all the companies and all the people in Delhi to not have power. That is not correct. Nobody wants animals to be harmed, but it is beyond your control if they die. You want development, or do you only want villages? That is the thing. And like talking to other people, I feel like they were not as frank in expressing their feelings in a similar way, but it captures something in terms of our orientation to the broader realm of non-humans, and the sense of responsibility that is felt towards them. Now, I spoke to a land aggregator in Jaisalmer, and he works with one of the companies, and has experienced firsthand kind of these convincing people to essentially allow companies to lease their lands for 30 years or more. And so he's seen kind of a lot of the struggles and distress and anxieties, and in some ways perhaps been a part of it. And he told me that this land will never be farmable again, right? He was describing how you have to put tons of cement and other chemicals into the soil in order to build the infrastructures necessary for housing the wind turbines and the solar panels. And I asked him, how does he feel about this? How does he navigate through the struggles around this? And he told 2 things that I remember quite vividly. The first one was that he asked me a lot about my thoughts about what's happening in Europe with wind and solar and so forth. And then he said, if the Europeans are going that side, it means that we are safe. This is our mentality. This, I think, says a lot, and it captures something that they'll circle back to in a little bit. But he said another thing that was also interesting to me, and it was that it is our moral responsibility to do what our government wants. And this was interesting. And I tried to follow up to see what exactly that meant to him. And his argument was that if the government has decided that what we need is solar parks for development, for climate change mitigation, etc., that they have done their due diligence and research and work. And kind of it is not my place to question that. I spoke with him several months later, and his thoughts had actually changed on these matters. Because at this point he had only been working in this sector for about 8 months. And as I was leaving field work, I remember him telling me, my mom did not raise me to have this ethics and morality, so I'm trying to leave this type of work. Yeah, but it's happy to chat about this more, but I think we should move on. But I think Ashish Nandi captures this kind of ongoing struggle as well when he says that societies could impose today virtually any suffering on any number of their people in the name of development, exactly as in earlier times under the guidance of experts in the matter of the soul. Witches were killed so that their souls could be saved. Now, trying to, conceptualize and write some of these things out has taken me to different rabbit holes and journeys. But I'll share some of my conceptual inspiration in order to say kind of how I'm thinking about going about writing this specific project. A few days ago, at a research paper that I wrote with several colleagues come out in Geoforum, and drawing from work of Mbembe, Meredith Taboom, Alexander Dunlap, amongst others, we describe contemporary energy transition practices as necropolitical practices that are leading to the death of agrarian and pastoral lifeways and other resource-dependent people. Something I've noticed as a trend over the years is when it comes to studying energy transitions, the extent to which research is often very focused on the generation, including research on energy democracy and energy justice and so forth, and a lack of interest in a way one could say to trying to redevelop what energy consists of to different people. The centuries of human relationship with land, sea, and other than human has resulted in a rich onto-epistemology of energy. Stoics with Numa Indians with prana, Chinese with chi, the Sapara nation of Ecuadorian Amazon with Chimaka, and the list goes on and on. Right? And the point is that when scholars limit their analysis of energy transitions to kind of colonial and hegemonic understanding of energy as being at work or as fuel, we are inflicting a form of epistemic injustice on all those who seek to enable or practice alternative visions of life, death, and creation. And in a way, our relationship with land can guide us in what Arturo Escobar refers to as rediscovering cultural differences, I believe. But I'd like to draw from grounded normativity, and the idea being that the ethical frameworks provided by indigenous place-based practices and associated forms of knowledge. These are practices, procedures based on reciprocity, inherently informed by intimate relationship to place. And it teaches living in relation to other people and non-human life forms in a non-authoritarian, non-dominating, and non-exploitative manner. And it kind of teaches how to be respectful diplomatic relationships with other peoples, nations, and with whom we share territorial responsibility or common political or economic interests. So the idea here being, and here I'm drawing from L.B. Simpson's work, as we have always done, that our relationship to the land itself generates the processes, practices, and knowledges that inform our political systems, and through which we practice solidarity. And I think this is a simple way to kind of think about this is, Tom Goldtooth, Navajo elder, who says that I'm an advocate for our native nations' development and solar, but most of our tribes have traditional belief systems that must guide us in these forms of development. When we as native nations create massive wind power projects, we must have ceremonies to obtain permission to utilize the sacred elements, to harness and process wind and sun into electricity that will be exported off our native lands into these colonial grid systems that don't directly benefit our people. Right? And you can extend this to how do you go about navigating through utilization of agripastoral lands with many of their own stories around deities and warriors and gods and heroes, and also being responsive to local onto-epistemologies of energy as other things. So with this, thinking of alternative energy future in the face of existential threats to place-based practices and lifeways and JSON, what are alternative futures that have a commitment to the well-being of citizenry? This is actually a meeting that was being held at the Barefoot College. It's a very interesting NGO. It worked with kind of feminist household rural electrification amongst many other projects. And here was a meeting with the Ministry of Minorities Affairs. And kind of they were trying to see what people's craftsmanship is and how the state can protect that. Just to give you some context, this photo is slightly different. But coming back to L.P. Simpson, kind of thinking on alternative futures, I think it's important to have an element of humility here, because there is some hubris in stating that, all right, I've spent some months hanging out with people in the desert, so I can now say what their dreams and desires are and how it should be go about, attaining them. At the same time, we do live in times of haste, and I get to meet and talk with these people, but also go to meet with members of Congress and policymakers, researchers, and so forth and so on. And what are the processes and procedures? I guess less so than exactly what is it that must be done. And I think this quote by L.B. Simpson captures it well, in that I cannot be prescriptive here, because these processes are profoundly intimate and emergent, and are ultimately the collective responsibilities of those who belong to unique, diverse indigenous nations, or agripastoral societies. There are some low-hanging fruits. This work that came out, I think some of this is actually quite problematic. We can talk about that, but I mean, doing these things would not necessarily question dominant onto-epistemologies or means of governance and practices, or industrial capitalism, but they do enhance socio-ecological well-being, and it's important that they're done. And we can think about some of the things like community energy and so forth in these categories. But the problem is that they fail to question the extractive and exploitative modality of social life. I don't think all community energy projects do that, by the way. It's a slightly different topic. And we need a more profound commitment to onto-epistemological polarity in thinking about alternative and better and emancipatory energy futures. There's a paper that came out in Nature recently. I actually like this. I can recommend reading it. And the authors argue that methodologically, adopting a cosmology of energy approach to local cultures means engaging deeply with local systems of thought, philosophies, and ontologies through the lenses of local systems of knowledge production, which means engaging with local cultural production. Right? And kind of thinking about our role as academics, as researchers, being in these areas, engaging with these issues. I like the work that DeLay here and Murray refer to as forms of defiant scholarship, right? They draw on Walter Rodney's guerrilla intellectuals, Walter Mignola's epistemic disobedience, to kind of, challenge coloniality of knowledge in order to enable a more plural epistemology, on which alternative notions of life, death, and creation and energy can be built, or rediscovered or enhanced. So what do alternative energy futures look like in Jaisalmer? Well, it says the topic of the follow-up fieldwork that I'm doing later in a few months. But just to give you an idea of kind of where my head's at, it's kind of paying attention to the intersecting socio-ecological struggles, right? I mentioned the Indira Gandhi Canal earlier, and how that created its own unique, struggles for local people with kind of ancient farming practices. So there's an epistemological element here, but also kind of a reviving ancient farming practices like the Khadim farming system. And I will end with a quote from Paulo Freire. Says that in the process of oppression, the elite subsist on the living death of the oppressed and find their authentication in the vertical relationship between themselves and the latter. In the revolutionary process, there is only one way for the emerging leaders to achieve authenticity. They must die in order to be reborn through and with the oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. And
Yeah.
I just realized actually, I was looking at the map that Jaisalmer is exactly the opposite side where I'm working.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, yeah, I mean, I mean, this is the kind of the part of the Great Indian Desert in the Pakistan side, and they actually probably the road districts kind of border, they are connected to each other, and it's kind of interesting in that sense that like from the Pakistani side, it's a coal coal energy block that is kind of driving the very socio-ecological change in the area. And so many of these things I realized that yeah, we have a lot more to talk about than. But I was just wondering like about two things. Like one, when you were talking of the land question, the kind of ownership of land. Could you like explain a bit more on like, for example, was there like some colonial during the British colonial period, was there a kind of land settlement policy or something? Because it seems like on the Pakistan side that a lot of struggle around land comes because people do not have like recognized land ownership. Because apparently the land settlement policy was like, yeah, you pay tax for a certain time, then it gets into this temporary register. They call it Mesh PR. And then from there, you will eventually have like, converted into private ownership.
Yeah.
And a lot of land was actually stuck in this limbo, in this temporary ownership register. And now when these companies came in for the mining and all that, and they all of a sudden they say, like, I mean, including the government, that oh, it was temporary actually, it was never transferred to the name, so you are not the owner of that land. And that has kind of come out to be probably I would say like one of the biggest kind of contestation between the development between the state, corporation, and the people there. And the second thing I was wondering, like, if you could say some words about like about resistance by local developers. I mean, if as you were saying, like there's this kind of emotive kind of attachment to land, and like and for example, with the trees that I was wondering if it's the same tree because there is one separate tree on the other side as well. Yeah, which nobody touches at all, and all this. So how for example, like then this sort of companies that go in and remove all this, they take the land, take the forests and all that. So how is like the people's response to that? Has there been some resistance, and what kind of resistance is there? So yeah, I mean there is a lot more stuff, but yeah, I will shut up here. So
No,
yeah.
Those are really interesting questions. And I mean, I think either one of the two can be several talks, right? There's a lot of intricacies or nuances there. But broadly speaking, the forest, so speaking to local activists and kind of studying speaking to forest department and so forth, both in Jaisalmer and in Jaipur, kind of deal with the state level kind of laws and regulations and categorizations. You will find that there is a general recognition that a lot of colonial land classifications and like kind of ontologies of land were essentially adopted by the post-colonial government. Which is why I have this quote that for a paper that I'm writing, and the title is "It's the same rule, just a different ruler," from one of the NGOs and activists in the Jaisalmer area. And because a lot of how the land classification was carried out was in order to protect areas that could be used for revenue for the British Raj and also the Empire. And what happened that is interesting post-independence in this regard that is now a problem is that when land reclassification was done, a lot of the Orans that have existed, and I was trying to share this. I had a photo in maybe I can just share this actually on Zoom as well, so people can see. See this kind of photo there. That book is from the late 1800s, and it is a kind of classifications of where the Orans were located. Now, when like the classification was done, a lot of people didn't think anything could happen to the Orans. So they didn't. There wasn't much of an involvement with where they start and where they end and where they are. And now, this kind of comes to questions of resistance. A lot of what is happening is people bringing lawsuits and also going around trying to collect information and data on protecting Orans. Because they're misclassified and they don't enjoy any, because if it's pasture land, locally referred to as gochar, then there are procedures for like appropriating that, and then you have to get equal amount of land elsewhere. I'm not saying that's good, because that also has, because animals have a relationship with land. You can't just like, all right, here's, we take like 1 kilometer from here and put, give you another kilometer there. Yeah, I think the kind of public land struggles have primarily been around reclassification of wasteland as Oran, and then the kind of court cases around that. There was actually a recent case in which people won. One of the Orans was reclassified as being so. So yeah, I think there is that. But to give you another example of resistance, I'll stop sharing. To give you another example of resistance, while I was in Jaisalmer, like last December, so about 14 months ago or so, people walked for 7 days from their local villages all the way to Jaisalmer to speak to the collector office and in the district. And that garnered media attention, but also a lot of people helping them along the way, giving them food and shelter and so forth on the way to get to Jaisalmer to talk to the collector. There is one of the problems that exists is that the village, the sarpanchas, so kind of like slightly larger than village areas, and these are local leaders who are elected democratically. They are kind of respected by people, and people listen to them, and they used to have more power over the allocation of these lands. But speaking to them, they felt like they are completely kind of not really taken into account anymore. That their concerns aren't heard, that their letters go unanswered. An important part of making the future of energy more democratic and just would be to decentralize decision making, but also giving more power to communities and subconscious at that level of decision making. To work on that. So point being that another layer is basically kind of the procedural things, that subconscious write letters to the district, they write letters to developers, they write letters to the state government. Then you have the sit-ins and protests and so forth. Because other states like say Gujarat have had a longer period of experience with these projects. Having talked to the researchers like David Singh who researched that area, there have been more kind of direct action type work being done in Gujarat than to the extent that I know in Rajasthan. Yeah. So hopefully that didn't make you further confused.
I'll use space for others to speak, but yeah, there are so many parallels on both sides that are really interesting. Yeah, we can continue later.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat as well.
Okay, so the chat had reads, thank you for the presentation, very interesting. I have two questions. Why did you select decoloniality theory? Has decolonial theory transformed your practice, methods-based analysis, and relating, writing, etc.? From Lillian. This is okay, so that's a very good question. There are, I guess there are several ways to go about answering this question. To me, this is primarily, I came to this from the perspective or angle of knowledge. What kind of knowledges are taken into account when we think about the interests or lifeways or implications of say solar parks or wind parks or industrial development projects on one second. Okay. Yeah, sorry, my video at work. Yeah. On people's lifeways. For an example I can give you is that if you talk to people who have been doing herding and farming in the area, they will tell you that like date palm cultivation, the pollination of bees, local temperatures, local rain patterns, etc., have been affected and changed since the introduction of the solar parks in the area, and effects on wildlife, etc. But if you look at the way environmental impact assessments take place, these knowledges are not really accounted for or considered or a part of really the conversation. And I also have to say here that environmental impact assessments are not mandatory for renewable energy projects in Rajasthan, which is a separate topic. But because they get international financing, sometimes the financial institutions require it. So they're carried out. But the way I came to this was primarily to what is referred to as epistemological injustice, to different epistemologies. I think the other one is this is work of Coihano on coloniality of knowledge and also coloniality of being, and how North Atlantic lifeways, high consumption and high energy throughput lifeways from Western Europe and North America kind of have come to dominate a hegemonic role in how we go about attaining better life, in which modernity and progress and industrialization and growth are kind of unquestioned as pathways for the entire world to follow. And there's a lot of, and what this does is that it erases entire alternative visions of life and death and creation, of living with the land and with other peoples and with whom one shares territories with, of forms of governance, right, and so forth and so on. I think it's imperative to maintain these. And kind of in a way we discover onto-epistemological differences in order to maintain a rich tapestry of lifeways. That would be the second thing. And the third one is the geopolitics is hard to ignore. If a country like India wants to get loans for a solar park compared to, say, a Western European country wants to get loans, their interest rates are going to be vastly different, which makes what is feasible to do, say, in Netherlands, not feasible elsewhere, not because of biophysical elements, but because of unfair trade agreements and kind of broader geopolitical elements. Now, India is has been able to fund a lot of its own projects. The government has been able to fund quite a bit of it, and also banks, because of the amount of investment that they have to make in certain priority areas. But those are some that come to mind. But this is a longer conversation, and definitely yeah, very interesting one. Thanks for the question.